Please welcome your panelists for Can the Open World Economy Be Saved? Moderated by Executive Director of the Milken Institute's Center for Regional Economics, Kevin Klowden.
Thank you, everyone, for fighting the crowds to be here. I can tell you right now that both the upside and downside of being at this time on a Monday is that there are lots of interesting things to see, and apparently the largest one of them is Tom Brady. So for those of you who are here to be informed and educated, we have an excellent panel with a number of wonderful panelists. I will apologize for the fact that we are missing one individual. Secretary of the Economy, Ildefonso Guajardo Villarreal, had to go back for preparations for the next round of NAFTA negotiations. As such, is that as we will all say, that we consider the NAFTA negotiations and ensuring that they actually succeed to be a key priority. I'm sure that Ailish would probably thwack me very hard if I said they weren't. So
I'm waiting.
Yeah. So. As such, I want to say that welcome all of you. This is a particularly important subject in terms of what we are talking about, in terms of key issues. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists, starting over on my left, your right, with Ron Kirk, who is Senior Counsel at Gibson Dunn's practices both in Dallas and Washington, D.C., where he's co-chair of the International Trade Practices Group. The main things you need to know about Ron, other than the fact that he's an incredibly engaging personality, is that he's the former U.S. trade representative under President Obama, and before that was mayor of Dallas. So he's got both the local and international perspectives that he can bring to us. Immediately to my left is Henrique Meirelles, who's the immediate, very immediate, just a former Minister of Finance in Brazil. He is particularly well known and highly regarded for an incredibly successful term as president of Brazil's central bank, Banco Central do Brasil. He also has served a number of other functions in both the public and private sector, and he's, including the chair of JNF Investimentos, and has a number of different key perspectives that he brings to us. So we're thrilled to have him here. I won't even count about his occasional dabbling in politics. We'll leave that one alone. Beyond that, to my immediate right is Ailish Campbell, who is the Chief Canadian Trade Commissioner. She's not only directly involved in a number of highly successful negotiations that Canada's managed to complete fairly recently, and particularly the negotiations in the EU Free Trade Agreement, but she's also been involved in a number of other key issues, including where she was previously General Director at Finance Canada and Vice President of Policy and International and Fiscal Issues at the Business Council of Canada. So she can update us on what's going on with NAFTA, update us what's going on with where Canada is continuing to be engaged on the global scene. And to my far right, your left, is Steve Ciobo, who is Australia's Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. He also, before that, was Minister for International Development in the Pacific, and has been was a key party to Australia's free trade agreements. And he has also served as an alternate governor to the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which means that once again you've got somebody with a number of different perspectives that he can offer to us. So we're thrilled to have him here. And overall, what I would say right now is that I will admit that we have a slight bias on this panel when dealing with the topic of can the open world economy be saved, is that we have 4 individuals who would actually like to save it. At least we certainly hope so. And that one of the things in particular that we need to be aware of in the context for this panel is that from the perspective not only of the recent changes in the U.S. presidency, but really throughout the United States and the general public as well. Even leading up to the election, we saw a significant change in the American populace's attitudes towards trade and towards protectionism. It's been a cycle that the U.S. has gone through for ages. For those of us who don't remember what the world was like before World War II, when protectionism was the norm, that is something that has happened, and not just in the United States. It's happened in Europe and in Asia in different cycles, and in Latin America in a number of different occasions. is not just an American issue. A number of different countries have been seeing resistance to what is viewed as globalization and international competition. There are a number of different issues in terms of what had been the ongoing march of the different rounds of the General Agreements on Tariff and Trade, or GATT, which led to the World Trade Organization. And the question is, what's next? What's next on a global standpoint? What's next in terms of multilateral and bilateral agreements? What's next for countries who have, such as Brazil, who have made tremendous strides in both economic reforms and increasing their engagement globally, with political uncertainty coming up? Mexico especially, where you've got a very highly populist leading candidate in the election that's going to be coming up on July 1st. And Mexico actually had been a country that had signed more free trade agreements than any other country. And so if Mexico retreats in any way, what does that mean for the rest of us? So we'll be having a number of different discussions here, and we'll keep our panelists hopefully very busy. And at this point, I can then move on and not talk anymore. So Ailish, I was going to ask you first, is that what have been the key benefits to Canada about having a more open trading regime?
Thanks so much for having us. And I do want to give hats off to our Mexican colleague who couldn't join us. He was in Washington all last week with Ministers Chrysler Freeland and, of course, Bob Lighthizer, working on NAFTA, and they'll return next week to continue those negotiations, hopefully towards a conclusion. Canada is an open economy, less than 0.5% of the world's population. So that means 99.5% of our customers are outside of our borders. The value proposition for us is very clear. It is about jobs. It's about jobs, middle-class jobs. It's about the ability to generate prosperity and wealth that can then do all of the other things that we know societies need. So it isn't just about trade. It's about understanding why we trade and then ensuring the benefits of that economic exchange extend to the whole society. And I'm really looking forward to exchanging ideas with the panel on that. And I know just how hard my Brazilian colleague has worked on reforms in his country. So again, open markets, and I think every country has to come to its own explanation and narrative and constantly test it with its citizens about why trade matters to them.
Well, thank you. And now speaking of reforms and colleagues, how essential has been the process of reforms undertaken in Brazil to its ability to compete globally?
Well, definitely it's a very important step towards becoming more competitive and being able to open for trade and keep opening up the economy, because one of the consequences of a very closed economy that Brazil has adopted this model for a long time, it's for the companies to become less competitive as a result. But now we are entertaining and conducting a series of productivity growth projects, one and the most important being, for instance, the labor reform, which makes the whole cost structure much better, decreasing litigation, making the whole process simpler for employees and employers. As an example, in summary, there is a very series of reform, not only on the fiscal side, which should provide more stability, etc., and conditions for investment to grow, which is already taking place, but also the productivity growth reforms. In summary, the country definitely is becoming more competitive, and it's going to be able to open at a faster pace. And that's the reason, for instance, we are moving ahead with the Mercosur European Union open trade agreement, and then moving forward to start negotiation with TPP.
Marvelous. And so now in contrast, Ron, you came from an environment where open trade was still, and the push for open trade and trade agreements was still the norm, but we've seen a period of constant and consistent growth over the last few years for all of the major world's economies. How could a disruption of trade threaten that? What are the potential consequences?
Well, I think that we know what that looks like, because when at least I accepted the role of trade representative from President Obama in 2008, trade growth was trending well below 2%. Most of the world's dominant economies were growing about at that rate. And slowly, many of those economies began to realize trade was stimulus you didn't have to put in your budget. You know, there's a lot of ways you could do that. There were only so many times you can go to your legislature and to your public and say, we're going to incur massive amounts of debt in order to grow the economy. The other way to do that is through trade. But I really want to amplify something that Ailish said that's important. However you do that, those of us who believe in trade as a driver of not only global health, but also as a tool to create jobs in your own community, have really failed to make that value proposition to the public, particularly here in America. They just don't buy it, and it's easily digested when someone runs for office on the proposition, well, you don't have a job because all these trade agreements are bad, and you don't have a job because we're letting too many immigrants come in, and we sort of wring our hands here. But I think a lot of that same anxiety among the middle class is what powered the Brexit vote in the European Union. And in that sense, and this is not a political discussion, I don't think Donald Trump's election should have been as surprising as maybe as it was disappointing to some people. But if you were sitting here as a leader of a developing economy and trying to find the right recipe of how do I bring jobs and growth and modernize my society, all you've got to do is look at those countries that have adopted a more open economic policy and looked at how they've progressed over the last 40, 50 years. And I think there's a pretty compelling case to be made that trade can be a part of that. So I'm not as much worried about the rest of the world as I am worried about the impact of our current administration's policies, thinking we can somehow decouple from that and just show up 5 years from now and say, okay, we're ready. Give us back all of our stuff. So I'm more concerned, frankly, for the first time with how the United States positions ourselves in a world in which we could be left outside of the global trading arena for some period of time.
And that potentially could be a very significant issue, especially if we have either a change in policy within the administration or a change in strategy, or with the next administration or anything else.
Well, we've had a change in strategy. I mean, and it's interesting that we are now so intently focused on the negotiations in NAFTA. And I am biased. I was privileged to make the recommendation to President Obama that the United States become a part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But one of the real hidden jewels of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we had completely updated and modernized NAFTA. And so now we are negotiating, I think, from the outside in, whereas we could have been in a much more favorable position.
Now, speaking is in contrast to somebody who is at a country that has, over the last 4 to 5 years, dramatically transformed its trade relationships. Steve, how has this changed Australia's position in the global economy?
Well, we've been very aggressive in terms of pursuing trade liberalising agenda. In the last 4 years, we've put in place bilateral FTAs with Japan, South Korea and China, comprehensively updated our free trade agreement with Singapore, recently concluded after 4.5 months an FTA with Peru, and of course the biggest step forward in the last little while, like Canada and Mexico, was for us to pull back together what was unravelling quickly, the TPP-11, well the TPP I should say, and put it back together as the TPP-11, or as our Canadian friends like to say, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. I just say shorthand TPP-11 because it's easy.
Thank you.
But we've done that because of multiple reasons. One is because, and this is often a question that's posed to me predominantly from Europeans, but they'll say, why does there seem to be a more favourable public sentiment in Australia toward trade than you would get from, for example, Europe? And I make the point that because Australia, relatively modest in terms of population size, around 25 million people, but the 12th biggest economy in the world, we recognise that our prosperity is very, very dependent upon our ability to trade. And in particular in our rural sector, for our agricultural products, 2/3 of what we produce we export. Now, we had to make a lot of tough decisions over a number of decades to put in place reforms of our dairy sector, of our agricultural sector, to reduce the amount of subsidisation, all of these types of things, all deeply unpopular, make no mistake, deeply unpopular domestically. But what they've done is set the country up for a long-term engagement of being able to trade with the region in a really positive way. And because now our rural and agricultural sector, lobby, voting base, understands that access to export markets is critical for their livelihoods, the whole community is much more favourably disposed towards free trade and liberalised trade. And so it's viewed as an opportunity, not as something to be defended. And that really has set us up. So now I've got the privilege of presiding over an even more active trade agenda. I mean, by the middle of this year, we will either have underway or shortly about to commence trade negotiations for free trade agreements with Hong Kong, with Indonesia, with the European Union, with the UK, with the Pacific Alliance countries of Colombia, Mexico, Chile and Peru, as well as what we call the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is all the ASEAN countries plus 6, including Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, China and India. So it's a very big trade agenda, and it's all about pulling down those barriers.
And fundamentally is that it's clearly had a tremendous impact on Australia in terms of how Australia, not only in terms of its international relationships, but even domestically.
Look, absolutely. I mean, we are now in our 27th year of continuous economic growth. I'm not saying that's all a consequence of trade, but neither am I saying that trade hasn't played a very big role in that. If you look at last calendar year, for example, more than half of our country's GDP growth came from growth in exports. We're also seeing a dividend in terms of the community. Now, like the US, we're not seeing wage inflation running as high as people would like. It's more subdued than the population would like. They want to see pay increases. But a point of contrast is we look at wage growth, the median wage growth in Australia over the last 20 years, we're sitting at around 50%, whereas in the United States, over that same period, it's sitting about 4%. So it's also worth just noting that it's not an inhibitor to wage growth by being engaged in trade.
Now, one question I've got actually for multiple members on the panel is that Canada, Brazil, and Australia are 3 of the richest countries in the world when it comes to natural resources. If you want an example, Brazil is the one country that has truly made ethanol cheap and effective because of its surplus in sugar, which has helped in terms of its fuel self-sufficiency. But each of these countries is that those natural resources have been a big issue in terms of trade and trade issues. Have they been a blessing or have they been a curse or a little combination thereof?
Well, it's absolutely a blessing. I don't think there's a country, a nation on this planet that would say no to possessing every known form of energy possible, from natural gas to oil to hydroelectricity. Canada's also one of the leading sources of uranium in the world, powering nuclear facilities which are emissions-free. So the sheer fact of having these resources is incredible. I think the real step change for us in Canada has been, I'll say, threefold. The first is putting environmental pricing. So as an economist, pricing the negative externalities of resource emissions, for example. We think that's important. I also hear business when they say you've got to take into account the total tax burden that you're putting onto us. So maintaining a competitive edge in Canada is very important to us. But we feel that putting forward a policy that can enable pan-Canadian pricing on carbon is important. The second thing is understanding that these resources have been there for millennia, that they are developed by fantastic private sector companies. Canada is a bit unique in that sense, that, very much like the US, but unlike perhaps the rest of the world in that we have private sector drivers and owners of our assets. But engaging First Nations communities, our Indigenous population has become absolutely necessary and the right way to pursue further development. And the third piece, I would say, is not resting on old, you know what, it's interesting. I just use the word old and I stop myself because I've heard our industry loud and clear. This isn't the traditional sector. These sectors are fountainheads of modernization, of innovation, of clean technologies. So they're part of the new economy as well, driving incredible services, I might add, off of that resource base. So it's absolutely a blessing, but then not kind of resting on the same way we've always developed those resources, driving towards new innovations that we can share with the world. I would say, for example, collaboration with China on the Paris Agreement and lowering greenhouse gases globally is one of our top priorities, and one of the reasons Canada is such an effective partner in that, and I look to my Australian friend as well, is because we are so strong in natural resources, and there's no way the family business is going away. Yeah.
Henrique?
Yeah. In the case of Brazil, the natural resources which offer more important economic results are either on the agriculture, the production of grains and exports, and also in the offshore oil. In both cases, it's necessary to have heavy investment in technology and equipment. For instance, the case of agriculture, that's one of the most important drivers for the technology investments, etc., in order to produce equipment, new equipment, new kind of equipment for all the kind of characteristics of the Brazilian agricultural sector and infrastructure. In summary, that's something which is not the natural resources that it's easy to take and make a profit with. And third, it's highly diversified throughout the country. Millions of agricultures, producers, planting, etc., and harvesting. In the case of the oil, same thing. It's not as diversified because mostly are evidently the large oil companies, particularly Petrobras, the Brazilian state oil company. But again, oil is 6,000 deep offshore on the ocean, and that also demands high technology investment as hard work. In summary, in both cases, we don't, fortunately, maybe, have the facility of that very inexpensive extraction and sending. We have to work hard for it.
All right. So that requires, in some ways, getting both domestic and international investment and partners.
Oh, yes, yes.
So in some ways, perhaps it's actually because it's not so incredibly easy, it actually requires more collaboration than it would be in some countries.
Exactly.
Now, Ron, just to connect with that, is that the U.S. Also has a tremendous amount of natural resources. We don't tend to think about it as much, but one of the things in particular in the U.S.
Well, being a Texan, I do.
Well, that's what I was going to say, is that one of the things that's particular is it really varies depending on the part of the country. You know, Texas has done very well in energy. Other parts of the U.S. have been very big in terms of agricultural exports. But some parts of the U.S. have done a better job of sort of adapting to this idea of taking advantage of free trade and trade agreements. Texas has generally been one of the examples, not only with NAFTA, but even more broadly. How do you manage to sort of sell that and get different groups to be bought in?
Well, it's a challenge, and I thought it was one of the biggest challenges that I confronted when I accepted the job as U.S. Trade Rep. And I was fortunate to work for a president who understood the broader picture that we had to continue to be engaged. But he also challenged me to accept the reality that if you lived in one of those towns where the steel mill had closed or the factory had closed east, you saw life differently. And I think because I married a fabulous woman who I've been married to for 30 years from Cleveland, and I'd had the opportunity to go to Detroit and go to Cleveland, I knew that everybody didn't look at the world the way I did. And not to correct you, Kevin, one of my biggest challenges when I walked into USTR was I told our staff, you can no longer use the word free trade. Because if you walk in a room full of Americans and you say free trade, you've lost them, because they believe this is one of those guys that thinks that cheaper T-shirts and laptops is a trade-off for our jobs. And one of our challenges, going back to Ailish's initial comment, the benefits of trade in a country like the United States, that's as large as Brazil, but substantially a little bit larger than Canada and Australia. Trade is 60, 70, 80% of your GDP. Here it's 13%. So Americans don't live with it every day. The benefits are, as we know, very diffuse. We all benefit from it, but the pain is so localized, and that's a much easier story to tell. So one of the things we have to do is go into those communities and help them understand the broader proposition. One way we bring those communities back to life is going back to Ailish's point that 95% of our consumers now are in places like Africa and China. And we don't have to come in on the tail end of that, as counterintuitive as it is. But it takes a very different conversation about what's happening with our economy and the fact that most of the manufacturing jobs lost have been because of productivity and automation and not trade. But that doesn't make you feel any better if they tell you you lost your job because we just put a robot on the assembly line.
And that's something I actually want to get back to in a little bit because I do think that's a very important topic. But I'll just say as one minor correction, when Ron said that the U.S. is larger than Canada, he meant in population, not in size. I don't recognize Canada's big size-wise.
Well, you know, again, the Texan in me allows me to say that. But back to your point, it is it bothers me, but we have to get over that for those of us. The Mississippi River is almost a marginal line in our country now, in terms of how people view trade, because like Australia, our farmers and ranchers horribly dependent on trade. Most of the natural gas, a lot of the new tech industry is in places like California, even though it was developed in Dallas at Texas Instruments in 1950 by Jack Kilby. But we can't live in a world, I love African proverbs, and there's a wonderful African proverb that says, you should take no comfort from the hole in my end of the boat. And as Americans, I think those of us, you know, in places that are doing well tend to go, oh, poor Detroit, poor whatever. And we've got to find a way to somehow address the needs of re-educating our American workforce for these jobs in the new economy and just being absolutely focused about driving the value of a smart trade policy to job creation and economic growth here at home.
Absolutely, and there are examples in the U.S. of places that have done that, such as Pittsburgh, which has gone from being what was a very heavy industrial steel town to now, ironically, being among other things, a center for robotics. So that adaptation is possible. Now, Australia, as it's liberalized its trade, one of the things that's happened is that certain industries have disappeared. That certain one of the most notable is that good luck buying a car that's made in Australia now. It's a little bit more effort than it used to be, but. How is Australia adapted in that? Because there's no major stories of massive protests or anything else. So what has Australia done to make that possible for its workforce?
Well, I don't want to understate the social impact of that decision. We, as a government of various political colours, had supported the Australian car industry roughly to the tune of a little over $1 billion a year. So since 2002, it was approaching $17 billion that we'd put into Australia's car industry, and basically Australian consumers were voting with their feet. The share of the market of Australian-produced cars was just getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And we reached a stage where we said, you know, this is crazy. We are propping up an industry that clearly is unviable in the long term. And so we had to make some tough policy decisions. So we did. We stopped support for the car industry in Australia. And General Motors, who in Australia we call Holden, Ford and Mitsubishi all withdrew from manufacturing in Australia. Now that did have implications, but as a government what we did was make sure that we were upfront with people about what the impact of that was going to be, and we put a lot of money into reskilling and retraining. So we made sure that we provided support in a number of areas. One, locally in the communities, to drive investment from new industries into those particular communities to help create job opportunities and to, in many respects, leverage the government dollar with private sector money to create more economic opportunity going forward. The second thing we did was provide support to the workers. So we would help them with licensing, we'd help them with retraining, we'd help them with career guidance and those types of things. And what we saw was a take-up rate from those displaced workers that was at least as good, if not better, than what you saw in terms of the general performance of unemployed then securing employment again down the track. And that helped to make sure that people could have a fresh start. And the third thing we did was look at what we could do around ancillary industries. So for those who'd been in the car industry, we sort of said, well, what are some other areas where there's still opportunities? So it's about those global value chains. It's about, for example, you had automotive parts manufacturers who we didn't want to see them go down because the car industry did. So we hooked them into global value chains so they could still become a component supplier as part of that chain as well. And they, of course, as they grew in size, they were able to take on workers as well. So I'm very upfront about the fact that it's not that it was uncontroversial, it was very controversial. But it goes back to, I think, being reasonably, and it's perhaps the most unsexy word you can use, but I'm old-fashioned, being very rationalist about the way in which we approached it. And as I said, Australia's, we're certainly not perfect, but we have had 27 years of continuous economic growth for a reason, because we've been prepared to take some tough choices around reform.
Ailish?
Well, no, there's also a great follow-up to the Australian story, which is that I think Australia, in its typical, I'll say, very out there, right? Very outspoken, very like this is the way it is kind of way, engaged your population in a very deep discussion about further ties with Asia.
Yeah.
And I really give hats off to successive governments for having carried on that conversation, because that systems friction, I mean, we know that commercial markets are controlled by state actors, that certain aspects are not contestable, that one of our favorite words as a recovering trade negotiator myself, reciprocity, is not always guaranteed in those markets. But I think where we take a page from that lesson as well is in saying, but where can we look at this as a partnership? Where do we have areas like clean technology, like agriculture and food, that we can engage with markets in Asia? But I think all of this does require, and I would just build and give real kudos to everyone on this panel, because every one of us in our national contexts has kind of had to come out of the neoliberal textbook, out of the playbook, which is very comforting to us, because I think we all know that at a macro level for our economies, open markets is going to be the best choice. But it can be, to Ron's point, incredibly painful for individuals that are left on the sidelines. So coming out of that comfort zone as economists and policymakers, engaging with other series of policies that are absolutely necessary in order to make the tough choices that you made on the auto sector and that we've made in Canada on some specific sectors as well, to address that dislocation. And I think give people a sense that they're being heard, that there are other opportunities for them. And I think what the most important thing that we have to, and if there's one silver lining, of which I'm hoping there's many, but if there's one silver lining of current US policy, it's making us all pause and say, have we been listening to those people who are anxious, very anxious about where the future of the world economy is heading? And if we have to hit the pause button to think for a moment about what flanking policies and redistribution and pre-distribution, like education for JK to 12 individuals so that everyone can participate in the economy, I mean, I'm going to choose to say, okay, so at least it's an opportunity to think about what else we need to do in order to make this sustainable. So capitalism that's sustainable over the long term and isn't just delivering great results for a segment of our populations.
Ron?
Well, I think that's easier for Canada to say because you ratified the TPP, and now the United
We're saving
States
a spot for you.
is still on it. Yeah, but as you know, the most
We're saving a
difficult
spot.
customer to get is the one that you allow to decide to go source for someplace else. But it's going to be, I mean, it's a very difficult conversation because our economy is changing. It's becoming more advanced. Not that all of our workers have to have a PhD in economics, but they need to have the skills to be able to work and as you talked about the transformation of Pittsburgh, we still make steel. But in Pittsburgh now, you go to the steel plant and they will tell you with pride, we can produce 10,000 metric tons of steel and we'll do it with 10 workers. You go in China, they want to do it with 400 workers because their premium is on job creation and keeping peace than it is efficiency. But it begs the question, where are the jobs going to come from? And it's hard to have this conversation about the merits of global economy without the more difficult question that's facing particularly advanced, developed economies that I just hear, and forgive me, I'll put on my mayor's hat, people look at me and go, where the hell are the jobs going to come from? And that is that anxiety. We're the first generation of Americans, I believe, that cannot as comfortably look at our children and say the one thing that every previous generation of parents looked at their kids and said, you're going to have it better than I am. And people are worried about that right now. And then with everything people are hearing about artificial intelligence, is it going to take away all jobs, some jobs? The underlying conversation about jobs and what do you do to deploy a lot of Americans who work in great jobs that are able to put food on the table, buy a house, send their kids to college. That's the more difficult challenge that we face underlying. If people are comfortable about jobs, they're okay with the trade stuff, because you can explain to them that all trade is just a fancy way for getting more customers down there around the world. But if they don't believe they have a future in that equation, then that's where the difficulty lies. Absolutely. And I wish I had an answer for that. I don't, but I do believe a massive redeployment of resources around education will be part of it. And I won't filibuster. I will make this one comment. I do find it fascinating that there are two quiet revolutions going on in this country, one about gun control that I'm more hopeful than ever because young people, but what you're calling it seeing this red storm in red states where teachers now have said 10 years of not investing in public education on the backs of public school teachers is enough, may force us to a more honest discussion about resources and what we're dedicating to the education of the American youth that I think could be very helpful.
Now, Henrique, you actually had to deal with a lot of uncertainty in a lot of different ways that even some of the other countries had not, where you helped to curb inflation. You led a number of significant economic reforms at the same time as Brazil became more engaged internationally in trade. How did you sell to the Brazilian people, and how did you, let alone the government, ways to create stability and reassure them even in the midst of all of these changes?
Well, the fact is that Brazil has had a history of closed economy, and now it became very clear that the model did not work in the sense that it went too much further in that route, and together with state interventionism in the economy, so on and so forth, all of that led to a deep recession in 2015, 2016, coupled with raising public debt. Then we presented that as a package, controlling the deficit, bringing the public debt down, improving the risk profile. As a result, interest rates is coming down, inflation is coming down. That has generated growth. But as part of the process now of reforming the economy and moving forward to generate jobs and growth, we are presenting also as part of that the more open economy, to bring more investment, to bring more technology, etc., in order to grow more and at the end of the day create more jobs. We don't have the same kind of question which US or Canada, for instance, face, because the international trade portion of the Brazilian economy is very small, is not relevant. Then this is not really an issue. The issue is growth and job creation at the end of the day, but that's not related necessarily of competition from imports or so on and so forth. Maybe that will become an issue in due time, but so far that's basically presented as the whole pack for more productivity, higher growth, and at the end of the day, more job creation.
And one of the things that Brazil has done is that it previously used to have issues in terms of its industry, that its industry was viewed as being good in Brazil but not competitive internationally. And a lot of that has changed. A lot of Brazilian industries are now viewed as being a lot more sophisticated and able to compete and sell its products around the world. For those of you who fly on commuter jets and do short-haul flights, you're basically only going to be flying on jets from one of two countries, Brazil or Canada. So
We've had chats about that.
Yes, and that's a good case that we do present, is the case that in the industries where Brazil adopted a more open trade position, and that was a specific move done in the past, for instance, the aircraft industry, and the results are very positive and very successful. And I think that that's the same thing with agriculture. It's again, it's open for foreign investment. Foreign investors are buying into that business, and it's working also very well. Not only in the production of grains, but also in trading and production of fertilizers and etc. Everything is open, and import of also. Of fertilizer or equipment, etc., is open, and that's working out well.
Wonderful. Well, that is something that's the kind of thing we actually want to hear in terms of the positive story and making sure that people are aware of it. One thing, though, that Ron has mentioned, I think it's come up repeatedly, is that one of the big threats ultimately, not just in terms of just the economic order and trade, is automation. We're hearing about automation all the time now. You hear about how many jobs have already automated, how many jobs are going to automate. For those of you who go and go shopping in a market, the number of self-checkout lanes has gone up. I'll say that Europe had that well before the US did. But you increasingly see it. You can go, you can go to a European McDonald's and they'll give you options of checking out, of doing your entire order by a touch screen rather than even talking to a person. And that kind of thing is that there have been talks about that spreading all over the place in the U.S. and in Canada, and let alone Australia. And so automation is a significant issue. It's enough so that we actually had a brief conversation with the Mexican Secretary of State, Videgaray, who was around yesterday, but was not, he and the entire Mexican delegation had to be gone for today. But for Mexico, they consider that automation to be a very significant issue, is that we do not focus on this, but it's one of the main ways for cutting costs and for competing internationally. And as all of the countries are competing on cost as well as quality, automation is a key question. So how do you deal with international trade and concern from workers in an era of automation? Steve, do you?
Well, I mean, this is common to the developed world, right? So whether it's Australia, as you said, Canada, US, or Europe, it's the same challenge. I'm not sure that there's a panacea to that. There is no clear consensus around that, because part of, and this is my view as a participant in the political sphere, part of my belief is that the reason we're seeing such volatility in constituencies is precisely because of this fear. Because people know what they're hearing, they know what they're reading, and they can see it coming. And then there's sort of a real stratification about the way in which they're reacting to it. To the point you made, Ron, about if you're exposed to trade versus not being exposed to trade. So what is the solution? Look, we all know the solution lay with, for example, education and making sure that people are coming through. And I don't know if this is correct, but I was told that if you're a white male in North America aged over 40, the single biggest sector of employment is as a driver. That's what I'm told, as a driver. Now, if you're a man who falls into that category, you don't want to hear from a politician telling you the key for your future, when all you're reading about is vehicle automation and Tesla and all of these things, and trucks will be driverless inside the next 10 years. I don't think they're really receptive to hearing about how they should go back and learn about computer science in order to have a job in the future. So this is going to be a really serious political challenge for many years to come yet, and we haven't resolved what it's going to look like, but there is a big rump of people sitting out there who don't have the skills to meet the market labour force gaps that exist now, let alone another 10 years' time. And how we deal with that is going to be the challenge.
Ailish?
Yeah, I'd say three quick things. I think our approach to learning has to fundamentally change, at least in North America and in the United Kingdom, where I did some of my studies. There's this idea that you go to university, you're like this fully formed individual, and you're unleashed on your job, which of course you have for 30 years. So the gig economy and part-time work and different forms of work are totally changing the nature of an individual's sort of experience with work, but also with learning. So this idea of lifelong learning and just making learning more accessible. So I'm pretty excited about tools that help us reach people more quickly. I'm excited about innovation in education to get more low-cost, effective modules. I'm excited about employer-driven education, where employers are partnering with education institutions to do better skills matching. The second thing is, I think what we're finding about algorithmic-driven business models, thank you. I practiced a little. Really AI-enabled and other enabled business models is that, which I'm finding really interesting. So I don't think we know, but I'm going to just like lay a hypothesis out there, which is that we're going to find that human and machine learning AI-driven models, that interactivity actually produces something superior. So leaving an algorithm alone and expecting it to spit out something fantastic, while not layering on more information or a kind of human sense of intelligence onto final decisions, will render that outcome inferior. So combining machines and humans. So like I picture a driver who may actually be able to sleep for long periods of time because, okay, now I'm on a big open space in Canada or Australia between point A and point B, but when it gets to a more complicated area, if the weather changes, I get woken up and I'm assisting the car. So we just don't know. But this idea that humans go away is impossible, but also the factor that we know there's going to be new jobs generated. And the last point I would say is that what we know from studies of workers who have been let go from blue-collar type of middle-class jobs in the heavy manufacturing sector is, interestingly, that women fare better afterwards in terms of finding a new job more rapidly and also finding a job whose total compensation, if not 100% of their former job, including pension, is closer to it than their male colleagues. And why is that? It's because women are, I think, just more open-minded for whatever reason of looking for service sector jobs and jobs that require a human-to-human interactivity, like nursing, like senior assisted living. And I think it's very important that we start breaking down the barriers of what is a woman's job and what's a man's job. And particularly because I see so much of the future employment growth being driven out of our services sector.
Ron?
That was well said. I mean, I agree with you totally. And again, the panel is about, can we save the global economy? And I've been a little bit trade-centric, but the one thing I try to do, at least in these discussions, is not make that issue of job disappearance a debate about trade, because it is so much, it is so much bigger than that. But it does lie in education and rethinking how we create value and how families feel that I can have a job that allows me to do the things that, my parents were able to do. I don't know that we're there yet. And again, I think the biggest impediment is our political debate. I mean, we have enough brain power to rethink through that, but sadly, at least, and I know this isn't a conversation about politics, but the reality of our presidential elections is they run through Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, and they're always going to be, that debate about trade and its impact on jobs is always going to be a much rougher debate than if it ran through places like Texas and California or somewhere else. But the bigger issues, Ailish, I think, is very beautifully laid out. It is rethinking the education of workers, thinking about what those next generation of jobs are going to look like, and making sure we empower our young people to have the skills to be able to do that.
Now, Henrique, you've managed to serve in key roles, not one, not two, but 3 different presidents in Brazil, and you've had to deal with a number of economic transitions. How do you keep policies consistency and people being engaged in the work that you've done in a number of the reforms and international engagement from one administration to another, especially given the fact that everyone here has seen some rather significant political changes. So how do you do that? What's the secret, and what do we need to keep in mind?
Well, there are differences. In the case, for instance, of my position as the president of the Central Bank with the then elected President Lula, when he invited me to take over that position, we had completely different economic policy points of view, and in general politics as well. I had just been elected to Congress by a completely different party, but the then Fernando Henrique Cardoso's party, the Social Democrats. But he decided to invite me because Brazil was facing a crisis and they needed someone to stabilize the economy and so on and so forth. And basically he asked me two questions. First, do you think that you can stabilize, it's possible to stabilize the Brazilian economy and start growing again? Number one. Number two, would you accept my offer to be the president of the central bank, which was critical part of that? I said the answer of the first question is yes. I think it can be done, and explained why. The second question is, I think I can accept, but provided that I have full independence, even when we disagree. And he accepted that. And then when he got very unhappy about the decision that I was taking, particularly with tightening the monetary policy at some points, and when he came to complain, I said, look, we have an agreement. I am honoring the agreement. Now it's up to you. And then we move forward. Now, with President Temer, it's different because we did agree beforehand about the overall course of action for the economic policy, all the reforms, and I explained to him why, etc., and he accepted that. Then the moment that he accepted and the government adopted those reforms, like the pension reform, the fiscal consolidation, as part of the government platform and plan of transition and so on, since the beginning, that is a natural process. In summary, I think the critical is, number one, for instance, these two cases was in a very peculiar situation because in the two moments, Brazil was facing an economic crisis, and it was necessary a solution for that, and that's the way it presented. And better than that, it worked, and then next time it gets easier. To convince the people. Yeah.
Outside of the internal issues is that there are also external forces, even outside of the countries represented here, where there have been some changes in the international order. Two things that are happening is one is that China is increasingly developing a stronger projection of its economic strength internationally. That is affecting Latin America, it is affecting North America, it is affecting Asia and Europe. And the other is that Europe is seeming, even though it's been signing trade agreements, is facing the potential probable departure of one of its largest economies. How is that affecting sort of the international trade order and international economies, and how do you adapt to that?
Mm-hmm. Well, we're almost through 1 hour of this panel, and I think it's incredibly important that someone say the World Trade Organization matters. So in the midst of everything that you just said, certainly all of us are members of the World Trade Organization, including China, including the UK, the European Union, Brazil, and many others. And it has served an incredibly important, I would say, particularly dispute settlement function. I cut my teeth as a negotiator on the Doha round. You know, maybe I'll retire and the Doha round will still be continuing. But you know, we're making best efforts, and you've seen some real innovations on the plurilateral on procurement, on IT, on environmental goods. I think for an ardent multilateralist like Canada, who definitely believes in the rule of law over the rule of might, and when we, I think, take a look out to, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals and our responsibility to ensure that global prosperity lifts up more than just our countries, but the entire world, because we know it's possible, right? Because we know we can do this together. When you think about that, it really does come back to the WTO for me, because not every country has, I think, the blessings of multiple technical negotiating teams. I mean, your agenda and Canada's, is frankly exhausting. I mean, we have to have multiple teams that are capable of executing agreements and complex negotiations. So I think keeping our eye on the WTO is incredibly important. I think then it is great that there are bilateral agreements like the CPTPP that keep us innovating on things like competition policy, on policies to enable small business. The start of this clip was about getting capital to small business, to entrepreneurs. That's where the new ideas are going to come from. I do think sometimes there's a certain amount of arrogance amongst policymakers, like we'll figure it out. Absolutely not. We have to unleash the innovative capacity of everyone in our society. And then at the same time, you can't seem Pollyanna-ish. So I think it is continuing to assert some of the key rules around market contestability and competitive markets that have got us to this place, and then I think we can share examples that will bring our Asian partners along with us.
Steve?
I'm in agreement. I think that we do have a lot of potential. I'm still very optimistic about the world. The old, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. I've got to say one of the most heartening aspects from a political front has been with the rise of some of the rhetoric around, let's call it protectionism or nationalism. There's been a doubling down by others to say, we're going to push ahead with what we can do, both in terms of bilaterals, plurilaterals, multilaterals. I was pleased in Buenos Aires at the ministerial meeting last year that one of the areas we did surge ahead on was on e-commerce. After more than 12 years, I think, of discussions, Australia, together with Japan and Singapore, took an initiative to drive an e-commerce agenda. Now, that agenda on e-commerce was to say, well, we recognise the WTO is still working in this space, but we still want to make progress here. And the United States came on board with that, which I think was a big sign by Bob Lighthizer to say, no, we're not trying to be an impediment. We still want to pursue new initiatives. So I think there's still a lot of encouraging signs.
Well, Ailish, I thought what you were going to say is I can't believe we were 45 minutes into our panel and we didn't mention China. And I agree with everything you say about the WTO. But I would say this, in the context of not just the WTO, but it's interesting, the makeup of this panel. At least I found we were the most successful in engaging China to re-embrace the initiative to open up their economy when we did it as a coalition. That's right. And I can, go back into my trade world and tell you how proud I was. Boy, we sued China 10 times. We won every time. It's because we had Canada and Mexico and the European Union and Japan and Brazil, and we did. It's easier for China to say yes if it's in the context of a broader discussion than if it's the United States coming over here demanding that you do something. And so, I don't think it is not just because we don't like how the message may be being delivered by the current administration. It is true that China needs to embrace those global rules and adhere to the global standards, respect intellectual property rights for the same reason you mentioned, Minister, that's how you develop innovation in your own society, and that we can work collaboratively. All of us have the ability to help every country reach their goals if we take the best from what we have and apply that, and that's the way we can all grow well together. So we're down to 18 seconds and I will stop, but I do think the conversation about China and liberalizing and opening up its economy as freely as we have, that reciprocity that you mentioned, Ailish, is critically important for us.
Henrique, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I think that definitely there is a question here of conveying the right message and engaging the people in the kind of changes that are necessary, not only as a result of globalization, of technology advancement, which is something which is happening. To give an idea, when first time I was discussing this question of globalization, I was campaigning at that time to Congress more than 15 years ago, and I went to my hometown, which it was the largest city in the state, but had used to be a small town from some decades before. And I was there discussing globalization and with students, and they were questioning this thing. Why globalization, and why do we favor globalization? I said, look, do you really know what globalization is? No, I said, look, when my grandfather in 1927 was a mayor of the city, and he brought the telegraph for the city for the first time. And that's when globalization arrived in the city. Why? Because then the cattle farmers and the producers of cattle, etc., they could connect to the international price of beef at the moment, and actually they began to get the price of Chicago commodities exchange. And as a result of that, they made more money, they became more effective, they sold products at the right time. That's the result of globalization. Well, that went well. I think that at the end of the day, what we have to do is the same thing. For instance, we are conducting now Social Security reform in Brazil, pension reform. That's terrible. 70% of the population are against it, etc. And my presentation to that was very simple. I used some example of countries like Greece, for instance, who had to cut the value of the pension 14 times in order to adjust the budget when they got into a crisis. I presented that, said, we have to avoid that in Brazil. At the end of the day, what we are doing here is guaranteeing that you have a full pension when you retire, even if at an older age. People like that. In summary, we have to engage people, and that's the most important message I think that we do have for all these important changes that are taking place.
Well, and with that, I would like to say that that is a positive message that we should focus on, and I want to thank our wonderful panel, and I want to thank all of you, who I know is very hungry and ready to rock the line.
I came with
Thank you, Kevin.